Living off the grid. Is it doable? Yes. Is it sustainable? We'll see. Stay tuned. Hey everyone, welcome to Beyond 1,000 Days. My name is Sonia. I got my Sacagawea braids going on today. I look like I'm 10, but I promise you I am an adult. So today we're going to talk about living off the grid. When my partner and I did the longest sea voyage in history a few years ago, we had to equip our boat for going to sea for 3 years without stopping. So 3 years without stopping meant that we needed to take every single item that we would need for the next 3 years with us on the boat and live off of only that. Now you can imagine how many lists we had and how long it took to acquire all those things. And the calculations were sometimes estimates, but in the end, we did have what we needed and we had more than what we needed. Now when we're talking about living off the grid, what exactly do we mean? The grid is often the electrical system that many refer to. So living off the grid means being self-sufficient in making your own electricity. In this case, I'm talking about being off of all city utilities. So that means not just being off of city power, but your own food, gas, waste management, and water. So all of these things we had to figure out how we were going to sustain for ourselves for 3 years. Now being at sea is really different from being on the land. And there are some slight different issues, but there's a lot of overlap. If you're thinking about being off the grid completely, it's really a challenge in this day and age. So our off-the-grid living kind of started before we left on the 1,000-day voyage. We were living on our boat and we had no external electricity or water, so we had solar panels and we had 12 marine gel cell batteries on the boat to store energy from those solar panels. We also had our water tanks filled from a previous location that we were on, and we were living on that water for like a month or two at least before we even left, because the place that we left from really didn't have water. We did, at that time, buy food from the nearby grocery store and a few other things. So in that sense, we weren't as off the grid, but definitely power-wise and water-wise, we were not using any city utilities at that point. So it was 2 months, and then when I was at sea for 10 months, I lived with no resupply from the land whatsoever, with just what we had on the boat. And my partner, who stayed out at sea longer than I did, you can check out the whole story on our website, he stayed out for the full 3 years at sea and lived off of nothing else but what he had with him, and he caught the rain for water. After a year of living off the grid, I definitely got some insights into what it's like to be away from civilization and all the stuff that civilization provides that aren't bad things. I found out what it was like to be completely on your own and depend on nobody for anything. And there's good and bad to that. And then there's the side where you come back to civilization and you realize what lavishness we live in, really. So the first thing is no variety. Being off the grid, you have what you have. The choices are very limited. You've got one, maybe another option, and that's about it. You don't have to agonize about which one to use. You don't have a choice, you just have to use that one. And I think that that's something I really enjoyed coming back to land and all of civilization, was that if you wanted options for some item that you're using, it comes in different styles and colors and functionality ranges, and I really like that. I like having that choice being at sea and just having to use the one or the backup that you have. It's okay, it makes life a lot simpler, but on the other hand, it doesn't allow a kind of, I guess, creative expression. Uh, do you need that at sea? I don't know. If you have all that you need with you, it's hard to get replacements. And for us at sea, there was no going to the store, the hardware store, or any kind of store. There was no ordering online and having it delivered. No, no, no. You're 1,000 miles away from everything. You're not going to get anything delivered to you. And anyway, that wasn't the point. But replacements are hard to get. So if you have a technical item, for instance, a bolt, you have how many bolts you have on the boat, you got to make them work, you know. And if that's the kind of thing that seems really simple that you can get anywhere when you're on land, but if you were self-sufficient, you wouldn't be using bolts probably, or over time you would be substituting what a bolt's job is with something perhaps wooden. Okay, so when you're off the grid, a lot of your stuff is going to be a lot less technical. So when we were at sea, we didn't have a whole lot of systems that required a lot of machined parts. So even though that made it a lot simpler, we didn't have a refrigerator, but then it becomes more manual labor. So if you don't have a blender, you're going to be mixing your stuff with by hand, right? If you don't have a mixer, or you don't have the appliances that make things easier, you're going to be doing it by hand. It takes longer, it's a little bit more labor intensive, but it can be done. And some people really enjoy that. And yet, if you're at the point where you're not as physically able to do things, having appliances to help you do them is really helpful and not a bad thing. Living off the grid also brought home the fact that alternative electrical sources of power generation can be unreliable. So on land, you plug in, there's always electricity, there's backup electricity. The power plants have backup forms of electricity in case a line goes down. You're usually not out of power for more than a day or 2 or 3. You know, it's days. But when you're generating your own power, let's say you're using solar power, if there's a week of cloudy weather, your batteries are getting low and you're not generating much electricity from the sun, you need to have something to supplement that. If you're generating power from wind, that's great, but if you have a couple days of no wind, which happens on occasion, then you're not generating the electricity that you need. So if you're off the grid and self-sufficient, having less dependence on electricity is probably key to your survival, because if certain things that you absolutely have to have depends on electricity and the environment is not cooperating with your ways of generating electricity, it can become problematic for you. When you're off the grid, it also means that you're in charge of your own waste management. Now, waste management is a huge, huge problem for us here on land, but we don't see it. Out of sight, out of mind. But let's say you didn't have anywhere to put your garbage except somewhere in your sphere on land, or in our case on the boat. What do you do with the garbage you generate? What do you do with that plastic packaging? It doesn't break down that quickly. What do you do with broken appliances? Do you just let it sit and rust forever in your yard? I mean, that's the thing about garbage, is that it's hard to know what to do with it. And then there's also toilet waste. So gray water, black water, how do you manage that? Now, there's a lot of alternative ways of managing toilet waste, and those are definitely worth looking into, and boats have composting toilets, but still boats need to go to pump out stations when they're on land, and when they're out at sea it can go straight into the ocean and it's fine. But it really brings home the cradle to grave idea of waste, of using objects. So we make objects, we use them for a short period of time, and then out they go somewhere, you know, to be laid to rest because they're no longer useful. And how do they decompose? How does that affect us and our space? Does it build up in a pile in our backyard, or buried in a pile somewhere in our yard, or is it out of sight and out of mind? This is something that I think that the civilized world really struggles with, and certainly when you're self-sufficient and off the grid, you're in a microcosm of that, and you have those very same issues to deal with. And it's on a smaller scale, it's kind of easier to manage. You can get rid of a little bit of waste, of one person's worth of waste or one family's worth of waste in a small area. It's doable, but when you have a whole city's worth, then it becomes really a management issue and an environmental issue. Another thing about living off the grid is that there are no neighbors. I think, now being at sea, there definitely wasn't any neighbors. We were the only ones out for as far as the eye could see and as far as you could walk and as far as you can take a car in a day. I mean, being out at sea, we were alone for thousands of miles in radius. A lot of people who are off the grid are singular. In other words, they have their off the grid house or complex, and there aren't any other people around necessarily. Now, there are off the grid communities. They do exist, but there aren't that many of them. And if you decide, oh, I want to be off the grid, I think it's best to be part of a community rather than being by yourself in the middle of nowhere in the wilds. Because while it's totally doable to be that way, there are advantages to having neighbors. Some of the advantages to having a neighbor who's also off the grid, just like you are, is that you can share your skills. Now, if you're self-sufficient, you need to know everything about everything. And that's really hard to do. Nobody knows everything about everything. Having a neighbor to complement your skill set is great. Having a neighbor will help both of you be more successful at self-sufficiency. If each person had a skill and worked with others of different skill sets, then working together would allow people to create more and better things rather than working by yourself. When you work by yourself, I think you're surviving, but when you work with others, I think you thrive. And that's what we as people, as humanity, need to do. We need to work with each other, not against each other as in competition, but with each other as in teamwork, and then we would be able to create better things. And instead of just surviving, like so many of us are doing, we would thrive. Also, who wants to be living by themselves or alone? People are social creatures, and you do need to have others around. And if you're one person living out in the wilds of nature, that might work for you. But if you have a family, what's your family going to do? What's your kids going to do when they want to go and see other people, or when they're curious about other things out in the world? So that's why I think that having a community is really important. If you're going to be self-sufficient, don't be self-sufficient alone. Be self-sufficient on a small scale. Does living off the grid mean isolation? No, it doesn't have to be. But somehow it does become synonymous, doesn't it? Okay, my mistake. Two things that living on the grid can really provide that living off the grid cannot is technology and experts. Yes, so you don't know the value of experts till you need one. Being independent of others, not depending on others, is what self-sufficiency is, right? And so when you need an expert in something to fix a technical piece, or just someone who knows a lot more about something than you do, when you're living off the grid, it's not always easy to find that. And you'd have to, get on the internet, depend on some electrical thing and the cloud and all that stuff to find your expert. So when you're ingrained in civilization that's dependent on each other and on third parties for various things, finding an expert is a lot easier. And it's great when you can find one who knows more about a particular thing than anybody else does, because it makes it so much easier to fix, to replace, to change, to modify, or to bring those skill sets to whatever project that you may be working on creatively. And technology-wise, well, I think that speaks for itself. Everybody worries about what happens when they don't have their internet, or what happens when you can't communicate, or you can't access people, or you can't access your bank account on the computer, or any of those things that we do to make our lives go forward these days. If you're self-sufficient, yes, you can have internet, but it's not totally off the grid, is it? So internet is very much a part of the grid and being part of the structures that society is formed around, especially today. And I don't think that the internet is all bad, and therefore it's not something that we need to shun completely, but sure, there are ways that we can modify our usage to have a better quality of life. More technology does make us dependent on others and dependent on third-party structures in order for us to have it and to make use of it. But is that really super bad? So my final thoughts on living off the grid: I really enjoyed my time doing it. I really appreciated having the opportunity to do it. I think a year was a good amount of time. You really get into a routine and into a lifestyle, and you find that you don't need that much, really. On the other hand, when I got back to land, I really appreciated having experts like doctors around who knew what they were doing, because I sure didn't. I liked having variety of things and replacements of things, and you can get pretty much anything nowadays in any color, shape, or size. So there you go. There are good and bad parts to it. Would I do it again? Sure. Yeah, I would. Definitely. I would live off the grid again, but maybe not at sea. Maybe not at sea, but I definitely would do it again in another context if I ever got the opportunity. So those are some of my thoughts about living off the grid. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.